Only special people were invited, my daughter-in-law said, smiling as if she had just told me something ordinary, something harmless like the weather or what she had for lunch, and for a moment I thought I must have misheard her, because the words didn't fit, not with the way she was standing there in my kitchen, not with the way my son avoided my eyes, not with the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the silence that suddenly felt too loud, too sharp, too final, and I stood there holding the dish towel in my hands, still warm from drying the plates I had set out earlier, plates I thought we might use together to talk about their wedding plans, to share in something that should have included me because that's what families do, or at least that's what I had believed for 68 years, that family meant you showed up, that you were there for the milestones, that you didn't find out after the fact like some distant acquaintance scrolling through a stranger's life. But Ashley just tilted her head slightly, that small practiced smile still in place, and repeated it, slower this time as if explaining something to a child. We got married yesterday, Margaret. It was very intimate, only special people were invited. And there it was again, that word special, hanging in the air between us like something fragile and cruel at the same time. And I felt something shift inside me, not break, not yet, just move quietly into place, like a piece of furniture being rearranged. In a room you thought you knew by heart, because I had always believed I was part of that circle, that I was, at the very least, someone who mattered enough to be told, to be considered, to be included in something as simple and as meaningful as a wedding, my own son's wedding. But Daniel cleared his throat then, a small nervous sound, and reached for his phone as if there were suddenly something urgent waiting for him there, something more important than the look on my face or the question I hadn't even managed to ask yet. And I realized in that moment that this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a forgotten invitation or a last-minute decision. It was intentional, deliberate, planned down to the smallest detail, including my absence, and oddly enough I didn't feel the rush of anger I might have expected, no raised voice, no sharp words, no demand for an explanation. Instead there was just a quiet stillness settling over me, the kind that comes when something finally makes sense after not making sense for a very long time. And I set the dish towel down carefully on the counter, smoothing it out with my hand as if that small act of order could anchor me to the moment, could keep everything from tilting too far. Because if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that people rarely show you who they are all at once. They reveal themselves in pieces, in choices, in the things they say when they think you won't question them, and the things they don't say at all. And standing there in my own kitchen, listening to my daughter-in-law explain why I hadn't been invited to my son's wedding, I realized that this was one of those moments, one of those pieces falling into place, and I simply nodded, not because I agreed, not because I understood, but because I was starting to see something I hadn't allowed myself to see before, something quiet and uncomfortable and undeniable. And for the first time I didn't rush to fix it. I didn't reach for an excuse or a softer interpretation. I just let it sit there, exactly as it was, and watched them both as if I were seeing them clearly for the very first time. I did not ask any more questions after that. And that seemed to surprise them more than anything else, because Ashley blinked for a moment as if she had expected resistance, something she could push against, something she could twist into another story where she would still come out looking reasonable. But when there is nothing to argue with, no raised voice, no accusation, people like her tend to lose their footing, and I saw that flicker briefly in her eyes before she recovered, smoothing it over with the same polished composure she always wore like a second skin. While Daniel finally slipped his phone back into his pocket and muttered something about how everything had been last minute, how they did not want to stress me, how they thought it would be easier this way, and I nodded again because the explanation did not matter nearly as much as the decision behind it, and decisions once made tend to reveal far more than excuses ever could. So I let the conversation drift into something safer, something shallow, asking about the venue, the dress, the weather, all the details that no longer held any real meaning for me but seemed to comfort them, as if pretending long enough could reshape what had already happened. And when they finally left, the house felt quieter than usual, not empty, just different, like the air itself had shifted in a way I could not quite put back the way it was, and I stood there for a long moment before moving, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else has gone still. And then I walked over to the kitchen table and sat down slowly, folding my hands in front of me the way I had done countless times before when I needed to think clearly, without distraction, without emotion clouding the edges of what I was beginning to understand. Because there had been other moments, small ones, easy to dismiss at the time, times when Daniel would cut a visit short or forget to call back, Times when Ashley would answer questions for him or redirect conversations in ways that seemed harmless on the surface but left me feeling slightly outside of something I could not quite name. And I realized now that those moments were not isolated, they were connected, quiet threads weaving together into a pattern I had chosen not to see, perhaps. Because seeing it would have required me to admit something I was not ready to admit, that the place I thought I held in their lives had been changing for a long time, slowly, carefully, until it became something else entirely, something smaller, something more convenient, and I leaned back in my chair and glanced around the room, at the photographs on the wall, at the framed picture of Daniel as a boy holding my hand at the county fair. His face bright with the kind of uncomplicated joy that feels almost foreign when you look at it years later, and I wondered not for the first time when exactly that distance had begun, when the shift had started from being someone essential to someone optional, and more importantly why I had not questioned it sooner, why I had accepted the small changes without asking what they meant, but questions like that do not change the present, they only help you understand it, and as I sat there in the quiet, one thought settled in with a clarity that felt both unsettling and strangely calm. If I had been left out of something as important as their wedding, then there were likely other things I had been left out of as well, things I had not even thought to look for, and for the first time I realized that maybe I needed to start paying closer attention. Not to what they said, but to what they had been doing all along. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because something in my mind would not settle back into the quiet routines I had relied on for years, and I found myself standing in the kitchen before the sun had fully risen, the soft gray light coming through the window casting long shadows across the floor, making everything look slightly unfamiliar, as if I were seeing my own home from a different angle, and I poured myself a cup of coffee, watching the steam curl upward in slow, steady patterns, the kind of small, ordinary moment that used to feel comforting, predictable, but now seemed to carry a different weight, because once you start noticing something is off, truly noticing it, it becomes difficult to return to the comfort of not knowing, and as I sat down at the table, I reached for my phone almost without thinking, opening the bank application I had used for years, the same one Daniel had helped me set up when everything went digital. Back when he still had the patience to sit beside me and explain things step by step, and I scrolled through the recent transactions slowly, not searching for anything specific at first, just letting my eyes move across the familiar pattern of numbers and dates, grocery stores, utilities, small expenses that made up the rhythm of my life, until something caught my attention, a recurring transfer, the same amount, sent out at the beginning of each month, steady and consistent like a metronome. Marking time, and I paused, leaning a little closer to the screen as if that might somehow clarify what I was seeing, because the name attached to the transfer was not immediately recognizable. Not a store, not a service, just a company name I had never paid much attention to before, and for a moment I considered closing the app, telling myself it was nothing, just another bill I had forgotten about, something routine that did not require a second thought, but the feeling that had settled in me the night before did not allow that kind of easy dismissal anymore. So instead I tapped on the transaction, opening the details and read it again more carefully this time, noting the amount $1,500 every month without fail, and I tried to recall when this had started, how long it had been there without me truly seeing it, and I realized with a quiet sense of unease, that it had been going on for longer than I could easily explain away, long enough that it should have been familiar, long enough that I should have remembered setting it up, and yet I did not, and that absence of memory felt more significant than the transaction itself, because I have always been careful with my finances, always known where my money was going, not out of fear, but out of habit, out of a lifetime of making sure everything was accounted for, everything had a purpose, and I set my phone down for a moment, resting my hands on the table as I stared at nothing in particular, letting the information settle, letting it connect to the quiet realization that had begun to take shape the night before. And then I picked the phone back up and scrolled further, going back month after month, watching the same amount leave my account again and again, steady, unquestioned, and I felt something shift again, not sharply, not dramatically, but with a kind of calm certainty that comes when pieces begin to align, because I did not know yet exactly what it meant, but I knew enough to understand that this was not random, not accidental, and as I sat there in the early morning light, the house still silent, around me I realized that whatever I had been missing, whatever I had chosen not to see before, it was no longer something I could ignore, and for the first time, I felt less like someone who had been left out and more like someone who was beginning to see the full picture, one detail at a time. By mid-morning I was still sitting at the same table, my coffee long gone cold, the phone resting in front of me like it was waiting for me to decide what to do next. And I realized that the hesitation I felt was not about the numbers themselves, it was about what they might confirm if I looked any closer, because once you understand something clearly, you cannot return to the comfort of uncertainty, and I had spent years building a life that relied on stability, on knowing where things stood. So this quiet shift, this sense that something had been happening without my awareness, felt less like a single discovery and more like the beginning of a much larger realization. And I picked up the phone again, this time not just scrolling but paying attention to the details, opening older statements, comparing dates, tracing the pattern back as far as the records would allow, and the consistency was unmistakable, the same amount, the same timing, the same recipient, month after month, without interruption, without variation. And I tried to recall any conversation, any moment when Daniel might have mentioned needing help, anything that would explain why I had agreed to something like this, but my memory remained stubbornly blank, not because I was forgetful, but because there had been no such conversation, no clear agreement, no moment of decision that I could point to and say, yes, that is when this began, and that absence became more telling than any confirmation could have been, because I have always been deliberate with my choices, especially when it comes to money, not out of distrust, but out of respect for what it represents, years of work, of saving, of planning, of making sure that I would never become a burden to anyone else. And now here I was, looking at a series of payments that suggested I had quietly taken on a responsibility I did not remember choosing, and I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath as I considered what that meant, because there are only so many ways something like this can happen. Either I had agreed and forgotten, which did not feel true, or someone had made a decision on my behalf, assuming I would not question it, assuming I would continue as I always had, steady, reliable, unquestioning. And as that thought settled in, it did not bring anger, not yet, but it did bring a kind of clarity that felt almost steadying, because if there is one thing I have learned over the years, it is that patterns do not lie. People can explain things, justify them, soften them with the right words, but patterns reveal intent, and this pattern, quiet and consistent, told me more than any conversation could. And I stood up then, moving slowly toward the small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept my paperwork, opening the drawer and pulling out the folder that held my monthly statements, the physical copies I still preferred to keep, even in a world that had moved mostly online, and I began to flip through them one by one, matching what I saw on the screen with what was printed in front of me, confirming that this was not a mistake, not a one-time oversight, but something that had been happening for a long time, long enough that it had blended into the background of my life, unnoticed because I had not been looking for it. And as I placed the papers neatly back into the folder, aligning the edges with the same careful precision I had always used, I felt that same quiet shift again, that sense of something settling into place, not fully formed yet, but undeniable, because whatever this was, whatever role I had been placed into without my full awareness, it was no longer something I intended to overlook. And for the first time since that conversation in the kitchen, I found myself not wondering why I had been left out, but beginning to understand what I had actually been included in all along. That afternoon I did something I had not done in years. I drove across town without calling ahead, without making plans, without giving anyone the chance to prepare for my arrival, because there are moments when it becomes more important to see things as they are rather than as they are presented to you. And as I pulled into the parking lot of the apartment complex listed in the transaction details, I sat in the car for a few seconds longer than necessary, studying the building in front of me, a clean modern structure with neatly trimmed hedges and wide glass doors, the kind of place that suggested comfort, convenience, and a certain level of expense that did not quite match the version of life I had been told they were living. And I stepped out of the car slowly, closing the door with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet afternoon air, and walked toward the entrance, noticing small details along the way, the polished metal railings, the carefully maintained landscaping, the absence of anything worn or neglected, all of it reinforcing the same quiet realization that had been building since that morning. And inside, the lobby was cool and bright, with a faint scent of something clean and expensive lingering in the air. And I approached the front desk where a young man looked up from his computer with a polite smile, asking if he could help me, and for a brief moment I considered what to say, how much to reveal, but instead I kept it simple, giving him the apartment number I had memorized from the statement and asking if Daniel Collins lived there, and he nodded almost immediately, confirming not only the name but also adding Ashley's, as if they were well known, as if they belonged there in a way that felt practiced and established. And I thanked him, stepping back without asking any further questions, because I did not need more confirmation than that, not when the pieces were already aligning so clearly, and I walked back outside into the warm afternoon light, the sun now higher in the sky, casting sharp shadows that seemed to define everything more distinctly, and as I stood there beside my car, I let the information settle in fully, because this was no longer a suspicion, no longer a quiet question lingering at the edges of my thoughts. It was something concrete, something I could point to, something I could no longer ignore or explain away, and yet, even with that clarity, I felt no immediate urge to confront them, no desire to call Daniel or demand an explanation, because confrontation, I have learned, rarely reveals anything new when the truth has already made itself clear. Instead, it often gives people the opportunity to reshape the narrative, to soften the edges, to make you question what you have already seen, and I had no interest in giving them that opportunity, so instead I opened my car door and sat down again, placing my hands on the steering wheel and looking straight ahead for a moment, considering not what they had done, but what I would do next, because understanding something is only the first step. What matters more is what you choose to do with that understanding, and as I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, one decision settled quietly into place, steady and certain. I would not say anything, not yet. I would not warn them, I would not give them the chance to adjust or prepare, because if there was one thing this morning had taught me, it was that silence, when used carefully, can reveal far more than words ever could, and for now, I intended to let that silence do its work. The next few days passed with a kind of quiet precision that felt almost unfamiliar to me, as if I were moving through my own life with a clearer set of eyes, noticing things I had once overlooked simply because I trusted too easily, because I believed that family did not require constant verification, and yet each morning I found myself returning to the same routine, sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee and opening my bank application, not out of anxiety, but out of intention, watching the dates, the patterns, the steady rhythm of transactions that now carried a different meaning than they had before, and I paid particular attention to the upcoming transfer, the one scheduled for the first of the month, only 3 days away, the same $1,500 that had been leaving my account without question, without pause, and I studied it for a long moment, considering how something so routine could carry so much weight once you understood what it truly represented, because it was not just money, it was assumption, expectation, a quiet agreement that I would continue to provide without needing to be asked, without needing to be included, and I closed the application slowly, setting my phone down with a sense of calm that surprised even me, because there was no urgency in what I felt, no rush to act impulsively or emotionally, only a steady awareness that the next step did not require confrontation, it required consistency, and later that afternoon I sat at my desk, again reviewing my accounts more thoroughly, making small adjustments, not dramatic changes that would draw attention, but careful ones that aligned things back to where they should have been all along, ensuring that everything reflected my choices, not someone else's assumptions, and when I reached the scheduled transfer, I paused for a moment, my finger hovering just above the screen, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood that this simple action, or rather the absence of it, would set something in motion, something that would reveal far more than any conversation could. And I canceled the transfer quietly, without hesitation, without ceremony, watching as the confirmation message appeared, brief and unremarkable, as if nothing significant had just happened at all, and yet I knew better, because sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that leave no immediate trace, the ones that unfold over time, revealing their impact not in the moment they are made, but in the reactions they provoke later, and I set the phone down once more, leaning back in my chair and letting out a slow breath, not of relief but of resolution, because for the first time in a long while, I felt that my actions were aligned with what I understood to be true, and I did not reach for the phone to call Daniel, I did not send a message, I did not offer an explanation, because explanations are often given to ease discomfort, and I was no longer interested in easing theirs, not when mine had gone unnoticed for so long, and instead I moved through the rest of my day as I always did, tending to small tasks, preparing dinner, folding laundry, each action steady and deliberate, as if nothing had changed, and in many ways nothing had, except for one thing that mattered more than anything else. I was no longer participating in something I did not understand, and as the evening settled in and the house grew quiet again, I found myself sitting by the window, looking out at the dimming sky, aware that somewhere across town, a routine I had quietly supported for months was about to be interrupted, and for the first time I was not wondering how they would explain it. I was simply waiting to see how they would respond. The call did not come immediately, and that told me more than I expected, because if something had simply gone wrong, If there had been a small mistake or a delay, I would have heard from them within hours, perhaps even minutes, but instead there was silence, the kind that stretches longer than it should, the kind that suggests someone is trying to understand a problem before admitting that it exists. And I went about my day as usual, making breakfast, watering the plants, folding the laundry I had left in the basket from the night before, each task done with the same steady rhythm I had always kept, yet underneath it all there was an awareness that something had shifted, something that would soon reveal itself, and it was not until the following afternoon that my phone finally rang, the sound cutting through the quiet of the house in a way that felt almost deliberate, and when I looked at the screen and saw Ashley's name, I did not feel surprise, only a quiet confirmation that things were unfolding exactly as they would. And I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I understood the value of timing, even in something as simple as picking up a call. And when I finally did, I greeted her the same way I always had, calm, polite, as if nothing at all had changed, and for a brief second there was silence on the other end, the kind that comes when someone expects a different tone, a different reaction, and then her voice came through, slightly tighter than usual, carrying a note of urgency. She was trying, unsuccessfully, to soften, asking if I had made the transfer for the rent, because there seemed to be an issue, because the payment had not gone through, because they had received a notice, and I listened without interrupting, letting her explain, letting her fill the space with details that only confirmed what I already knew. And when she finished there was a pause, a small gap where she seemed to be waiting for reassurance, for an apology, for the familiar response she had likely come to expect, and I held that silence for just a moment longer before speaking, choosing my words carefully, not to provoke, not to accuse, but simply to state what was already true. And I told her that I had not made the transfer, that there must be some misunderstanding if she had expected one, and I could almost hear the shift on the other end of the line, the subtle change in her breathing, the quick calculation of what to say next, how to redirect the conversation, how to restore the pattern that had just been broken. And she laughed lightly, a sound that did not quite reach the rest of her voice, suggesting that perhaps I had forgotten, that these things happen, that it was no problem, I could simply take care of it now, and I let her finish, let the suggestion settle between us, and then I repeated, just as calmly, that I had not forgotten, that I had simply chosen not to make the payment. And this time the silence that followed was different, heavier, more uncertain, because there are moments when people realize that the rules they have been relying on no longer apply. And I could feel that realization beginning to take shape on her end of the call, and I sat there, holding the phone to my ear, not rushing to fill the silence, not offering anything more than what I had already said, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is allow someone else to sit with the consequences of what they assumed would never change. She did not respond right away, and in that pause I could almost hear the shift happening in her mind, the quiet recalculation of expectations, the realization that the familiar path she had relied on was no longer available, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had changed, not dramatically, but enough that the difference was unmistakable, the softness replaced with something more direct, more strained as she asked why, as if the answer should be simple, as if I owed her an explanation for stepping outside a role I had never formally agreed to in the first place, and I considered the question for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood that how I responded would define what came next, and I chose not to explain everything, not to list the transactions or describe the visit to the apartment or recount the realization that had been building piece by piece, because explanations invite debate, they create space for denial, for deflection, for carefully crafted responses that shift responsibility away from where it belongs, and I had no interest in opening that door. So instead I kept my voice steady and said that I had been reviewing my finances and decided to make some changes, that I would no longer be covering expenses that had not been clearly discussed with me. And there was another pause, longer this time, followed by a quick attempt to regain control of the conversation. She said that Daniel had mentioned helping out, that it had been understood, that these things were normal within families, and I listened without interrupting, recognizing the pattern for what it was, the gentle reframing of something that had never been explicitly agreed upon into something that now sounded reasonable, expected, even necessary, and when she finished, I responded just as calmly, pointing out that if it had truly been understood, then it would have been discussed openly, that I would have been included in the conversation, not left to discover it on my own through a series of transactions that had quietly continued without my awareness, and this time there was no immediate reply, only a silence that felt heavier than before, because the truth, when stated plainly, does not leave much room for adjustment, and I could sense that she was searching for another angle, another way to reframe the situation, but finding fewer options than she had expected, and after a moment she shifted again, her tone softening slightly as she said that they were in a difficult position now, that the payment was overdue, that they needed to resolve it quickly, and I let her speak, let the urgency fill the space, and then I replied with the same measured calm I had maintained throughout the call, telling her that I understood it was a situation they would need to handle, but that it was not one I would be resolving for them, and for a brief second there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, quickly controlled, quickly masked, but still there, a small break in the composure she had worked to maintain, and I realized then that this was the moment when the reality of the situation was settling in, not fully, not completely, but enough to disrupt the assumptions that had been in place for so long, and I did not rush to fill the silence that followed. I did not offer alternatives or soften my words, because sometimes the most important thing you can do is allow someone to sit with the consequences of what they have taken for granted, and as I held the phone in my hand, listening to the quiet on the other end, I understood that this was no longer just about a missed invitation or an unspoken agreement, it was about something much clearer, much simpler. The difference between what had been assumed and what was actually true. When the call ended, I did not move right away. I simply sat there with the phone still in my hand, listening to the quiet hum of the house around me, the same familiar sounds that had always been there, unchanged, steady, reliable, and for a moment I let that stillness settle over me, not as an escape, but as a confirmation that while other things had shifted, this part of my life remained exactly as it should be, and I placed the phone down gently on the table, aligning it carefully with the edge the way I had done countless times before, a small habit that suddenly felt more intentional than routine, because everything I was doing now carried a sense of awareness that had been missing before, and I stood up slowly, walking toward the window where the late afternoon light stretched across the yard, casting long shadows that moved quietly with the passing of time, and I found myself thinking not about what had just been said, but about everything that had led to it, the small moments, the overlooked details, the gradual shift from inclusion to distance that I had accepted without question, not because I did not notice but because I chose to trust, and trust, I realized, is not something that disappears all at once, it fades slowly when it is not acknowledged, when it is replaced by assumptions that go unspoken, and as I stood there, I understood that this was not just about money, not just about a missed conversation or an unspoken agreement, it was about something much deeper, the quiet way in which I had been moved from one place in their lives to another without being told, without being asked, and for the first time I did not feel the need to reclaim that place because I could see it clearly now for what it had become, something conditional, something convenient, something that existed only as long as I continued to fulfill a role that had never been fully defined, and I turned away from the window then, moving back into the kitchen where everything was exactly as I had left it, the counters clean, the dishes put away, the order of the room reflecting the kind of stability I had always maintained, and I realized that I did not need to change anything here, not in this space, not in this life that I had built carefully over the years. What needed to change had already begun, quietly, without disruption, without announcement, simply by choosing not to continue something that no longer aligned with what I understood to be true, and I picked up the dish towel again, folding it neatly before placing it back where it belonged, the motion simple, deliberate, final in a way that did not require words, because sometimes the most meaningful conclusions are not spoken, they are lived, reflected in the choices you make moving forward. And as the evening light faded and the house settled into its familiar rhythm, I felt a sense of clarity that had been absent for longer than I cared to admit, not because everything was resolved, but because I no longer needed it to be resolved in the way I once thought I did, and somewhere across town, I knew that the consequences of a single decision were beginning to unfold, not with noise or confrontation, but with quiet inevitability, and, for the first time I was not waiting for an apology, not hoping for an explanation, I was simply allowing things to be exactly as they were, knowing that what mattered most had already been decided, not by them but by me.